November 19, 1943. The coral fortress of Tarawa rises from the Pacific like a concrete nightmare. Admiral Keiji Shibasaki surveys his domain, bunkers built with 3-foot-thick reinforced concrete, 8-inch naval rifles, and machine gun nests positioned for interlocking fields of death. 4,500 Japanese defenders occupy this tiny island, each sworn to die rather than surrender. Shibasaki's voice carries across the fortifications with absolute certainty. 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. His confidence isn't mere bravado. Every approach to the island funnels attackers into predetermined kill zones. Underwater obstacles and coral reefs will ground landing craft hundreds of yards from shore, forcing invaders to wade through chest-deep water under devastating fire. The defenses represent years of engineering and the concentrated power of the Japanese Empire. But 18 miles away, 18,000 United States Marines are loading into landing craft, backed by the full industrial might of American democracy. In 76 hours, Shibasaki's fortress will be silent. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The tropical sun blazed mercilessly over Tarawa Atoll as Admiral Keiji Shibasaki made his final inspection of the defenses. The small coral island, barely 2 miles long and half a mile wide, had been transformed into what Japanese military planners called an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Shibasaki walked the perimeter, his boots crunching on the crushed coral that formed the island's foundation, examining each gun emplacement with the methodical precision that had earned him command of this critical outpost. The admiral paused at his flagship defensive position, a massive concrete bunker housing an 8-inch naval rifle salvaged from a damaged cruiser. The gun's barrel pointed toward the lagoon, where any amphibious assault would have to approach. 3 feet of reinforced concrete surrounded the position, with steel rails from the narrow-gauge railway embedded in the structure for additional strength. Machine gun ports provided overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that any enemy reaching the beach would face a crossfire that no human force could survive. "Sir," called his aide, approaching with the latest intelligence reports. "American reconnaissance flights have increased significantly. Their submarines have been spotted conducting detailed surveys of our reef formations." Shibasaki nodded grimly. The Americans were coming, that much was certain, but they had no conception of what awaited them. Every lesson learned from failed Allied amphibious assaults had been incorporated into Tarawa's defenses. The beaches were mined, the approaches blocked with underwater obstacles, and every inch of the island's perimeter was covered by interlocking fields of machine gun fire. The admiral's confidence wasn't unfounded. Japan had spent nearly 2 years fortifying this position, pouring concrete and steel into defensive works that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Underground tunnels connected the major positions, allowing defenders to move unseen while maintaining communication and supply lines. Even if the Americans managed to land, they would face a labyrinth of death designed to extract maximum casualties from any attacking force. As evening approached, Shibasaki gathered his officers for what would prove to be their final briefing. The command bunker, lit by electric bulbs powered by the island's generator, hummed with quiet confidence. Maps covered the walls, showing every defensive position, every obstacle, every prepared ambush point. The numbers told the story: 4,500 Japanese defenders, 14 coastal defense guns, 40 artillery pieces, and over 100 machine gun positions. "Gentlemen," Shibasaki began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction, "tomorrow or the next day the Americans will come. They will bring many ships, many planes, many men. But they do not understand what we have built here. This island is a fortress that cannot be taken by any force on earth. 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. The officers nodded in agreement. They had seen the defensive preparations with their own eyes, had participated in the months of back-breaking labor that had transformed a peaceful coral atoll into an instrument of war. Every position had been tested, every field of fire calibrated, every possible landing site covered by devastating crossfire. Yet, beneath the confident facade, Shibasaki harbored private concerns that he would never voice to his subordinates. Supply lines from Japan had become increasingly unreliable as American submarines took their toll on merchant shipping. Food rations had been reduced twice in the past month, and ammunition reserves, while substantial, were not unlimited. The garrison's morale remained high, but the isolation was beginning to wear on even the most dedicated soldiers. 18 miles northeast of Tarawa, the largest amphibious assault force ever assembled in the Pacific prepared for battle. Lieutenant Colonel David Shoup stood on the deck of the transport ship Xylan, studying aerial photographs of the target through a magnifying glass. Every detail of the Japanese defenses was visible in the grainy black and white images: the concrete bunkers, the gun positions, the obstacles in the lagoon. Shoup had been selected to command the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marine Regiment in the assault on Tarawa's main island, Baitio. At 39 years old, he was a veteran of the Guadalcanal campaign, where he had earned a reputation for tactical innovation and unshakable courage under fire. But Tarawa represented a challenge unlike anything the Marines had previously attempted. The statistics were staggering. Operation Galvanic, as the assault was codenamed, involved 200 ships, 35,000 men, and enough supplies to sustain operations for months if necessary. The fleet included 17 aircraft carriers, 12 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, and dozens of destroyers and transports. This concentration of naval power represented the pinnacle of American industrial achievement, a force that would have been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. Central to the operation were the new LVT-1 Alligators, was amphibious, tractors that could carry Marines directly onto the beach without stopping at the reef's edge. These ungainly vehicles, looking like boats with tank tracks, represented a revolution in amphibious warfare. Unlike traditional landing craft, which would ground on Tarawa's coral reef and force Marines to wade hundreds of yards under fire, the LVTs could crawl over the coral and deliver their passengers directly to the shore. The industrial statistics behind the operation told their own story. The Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans was producing one landing craft every 17 minutes, 24 hours a day. American shipyards had launched more tonnage in the past year than the rest of the world combined. The Boeing plants in Seattle were delivering B-24 bombers at a rate of one every 63 minutes. This was industrial warfare on a scale that no previous civilization had imagined possible. Shoup reviewed the assault plan one final time. The preliminary bombardment would begin at dawn, with battleships and cruisers pounding the Japanese positions for 3 hours. Carrier-based aircraft would follow up with precision strikes on specific targets identified through reconnaissance. Then the Marines would go in, wave after wave, until the island was secured. The plan looked flawless on paper, but Shoup had learned to distrust easy victories. Intelligence estimates suggested that 2,500 to 3,000 Japanese defenders occupied the island, a significant force, but one that should be overwhelmed by the Marines' superior numbers and firepower. What concerned Shoup were the unknowns: the effectiveness of the preliminary bombardment, the condition of the coral reef at high tide, the resilience of those concrete bunkers. As night fell over the task force, Shoup addressed his battalion commanders. The men gathered in the ship's wardroom, their faces illuminated by the harsh electric lights. Maps and photographs covered every available surface, showing the beach assignments, objective lines, and contingency plans that would guide the assault. "Gentlemen," Shoup began, "tomorrow we're going to take Tarawa. The Navy is going to soften them up for us, and then we're going in hard and fast. This isn't going to be another Guadalcanal. We're not going to spend months fighting over jungle trails. We're going to hit that beach, secure our objectives, and move on to the next target." The confidence in Shoup's voice was genuine, backed by months of intensive training and the knowledge that American industrial might was behind every aspect of the operation. Yet he also understood the human cost that lay ahead. Amphibious assault was the most dangerous form of warfare, requiring men to advance across open ground under fire, with no retreat possible, and success measured in yards gained at the cost of lives lost. At 0445 hours on November 20th, 1943, the pre-dawn darkness over Tarawa was shattered by the muzzle flashes of 16-inch naval rifles. The battleships Maryland and Colorado opened the bombardment, their massive shells screaming through the humid air before detonating among the Japanese positions with earth-shaking violence. Each shell weighed as much as a small automobile and carried enough explosive power to destroy a city block. The preliminary bombardment represented the concentrated fury of American industrial production. The Maryland alone carried 1,800 tons of ammunition, more than the entire Japanese garrison could fire in a year of continuous combat. Every 3 minutes, another salvo thundered from the battleship's guns, each round manufactured in American steel mills, filled with American explosives, and delivered by American crews who had trained for this moment since Pearl Harbor. From his command bunker on Betio, Admiral Shibasaki watched the bombardment with growing concern. The concrete walls shook with each nearby impact, sending clouds of coral dust cascading from the ceiling. Electric lights flickered and went out as shock waves severed power cables. The methodical precision of the American fire was unlike anything the Japanese had experienced. Not the random harassment of long-range artillery, but the systematic destruction of a fortress by overwhelming firepower. At 0630 hours, carrier-based aircraft joined the bombardment. TBF Avengers and SPD Dauntless dive bombers swept down from the gray dawn sky, their bombs adding to the crescendo of destruction. The Americans had learned from previous amphibious operations that preliminary bombardment was not just about destroying enemy positions. It was about breaking the will to resist through the sheer demonstration of irresistible power. Lieutenant Colonel Shoup watched the bombardment from the deck of his transport, timing the intervals between salvos and noting the points of impact through binoculars. The island seemed to disappear beneath clouds of smoke and flying debris. Surely nothing could survive such concentrated destruction. Yet Shoup had read the intelligence reports about Japanese defensive construction. Those bunkers were built to withstand battleship bombardment, designed by engineers who understood that concrete and steel could absorb punishment that would devastate conventional fortifications. At odd 1900 hours, the first wave of Marines climbed into their LVT-1 amphibious tractors. Each vehicle carried 18 fully equipped Marines, along with their weapons, ammunition, and the determination that had carried American forces across the Pacific. The LVTs formed up in precise lines, their diesel engines coughing blue smoke as they prepared for the run to shore. Shoup's command LVT led the formation toward the lagoon entrance. Behind him stretched a line of amphibious vehicles that seemed to extend to the horizon, wave after wave of Marines heading for the beaches of Betio. The sight should have been reassuring, but Shoup noticed that the naval bombardment had failed to destroy the Japanese obstacles in the lagoon. Concrete tetrahedrons and steel rails still protruded from the water, forcing the LVTs to navigate carefully through the gaps. As the first amphibious tractors approached the reef, Japanese defenders who had survived the bombardment emerged from their bunkers. Machine guns that had been silent during the 3-hour bombardment suddenly opened fire, their tracers arcing across the water toward the approaching Marines. The LVTs were lightly armored, designed for mobility rather than protection, and the Japanese gunners had spent months calculating the exact range and deflection needed to hit targets in the lagoon. The first Marine casualties occurred before anyone reached the beach. LVT-43 took a direct hit from a 37mm anti-tank gun and burst into flames, its crew and passengers lost in seconds. Machine gun bullets punched through the thin armor of other vehicles, killing and wounding Marines who had not yet fired a shot in anger, but the amphibious tractors kept coming. For every LVT disabled by enemy fire, 3 more took its place. This was the essence of American industrial warfare, the ability to absorb losses and to continue advancing through sheer weight of numbers and material superiority. The Japanese had built their defensive strategy around the assumption that they could inflict enough casualties to force the Americans to withdraw. They had not anticipated an enemy with virtually unlimited reserves of men and equipment. As the first wave of Marines struggled across Betio's deadly beaches, the true scale of American industrial might became apparent. Behind the initial assault, a continuous stream of reinforcements and supplies flowed toward the island like a mechanical tide that nothing could stop. Every 3 minutes, another wave of landing craft approached the reef, each carrying marines, ammunition, medical supplies, or the specialized equipment needed to crack Japan's Pacific fortress. Major Henry Crowe, commanding the 2nd Battalion Support Company, watched from his command post as the industrial logistics of modern warfare unfolded before him. LSTs, landing ship tanks, each capable of carrying 20 Sherman tanks or 40 trucks, waited offshore for the beaches to be secured. Behind them, transport ships loaded with enough ammunition to sustain combat operations for 6 months maintained perfect formation. Despite the ongoing battle, the numbers told a story that Admiral Shibasaki could never have imagined. American factories were producing 60,000 aircraft per year, more than the total number of planes in the Japanese Air Force. The single Willow Run plant in Michigan manufactured one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day. Ford's new Jeep factory delivered a completed vehicle every 80 seconds. This was production on a scale that transformed warfare from a contest between armies into a demonstration of competing economic systems. Crowe's radio man handed him a message from the Fleet Command. Additional ammunition ships standing by. Request immediate beach clearance for unloading operations. The message illustrated the fundamental difference between American and Japanese approaches to warfare. While the Japanese had stockpiled supplies for a defensive battle of limited duration, the Americans assumed unlimited access to reinforcements and resupply. They fought not with the resources currently available, but with the full productive capacity of the world's largest industrial economy. On the beach, Lieutenant William Hawkins led his scout sniper platoon toward a Japanese strongpoint that had survived the naval bombardment. The concrete bunker, built into a coral outcropping, commanded the entire landing area with interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Traditional infantry tactics would have required massive casualties to reduce such a position, but Hawkins had access to weapons that represented the cutting edge of American military technology. The flamethrower team moved forward under covering fire, their equipment manufactured by the Chemical Warfare Service using industrial techniques perfected in Detroit's automotive plants. The napalm mixture had been developed by Harvard chemists working under a government contract, combining jelly-like gasoline with specialized additives that ensured maximum adhesion and burning temperature. When the operator triggered the device, a stream of liquid fire engulfed the bunker's firing ports, forcing the Japanese defenders to choose between burning alive and abandoning their positions. Behind the assault troops, Navy Seabees, construction battalions recruited from America's civilian construction industry, began clearing obstacles and preparing landing areas for heavy equipment. These men brought industrial efficiency to battlefield engineering, using techniques learned building highways and skyscrapers to create infrastructure under fire. Within hours of the initial landing, they had cleared vehicle paths through the coral rubble and established fuel dumps, ammunition storage areas, and medical stations. The Japanese defenders fought with desperate courage, but they faced an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited resources. Every position destroyed by American forces was immediately replaced by new equipment landed from the fleet. Every Marine casualty was evacuated and replaced by fresh reinforcements. The Americans fought not as individuals risking everything on a single battle, but as components of an industrial system that could absorb losses and continue advancing until victory was achieved. As afternoon approached, the fundamental asymmetry of the battle became clear to both sides. Japan had committed its available resources to building an impregnable fortress, but America had committed its industrial capacity to building an unstoppable assault force. It was concrete and steel against production lines and logistics networks, the fixed defenses of a besieged empire against the mobile power of an industrial democracy, the coral sand of Red Beach. Two churned into a bloody paste as Marines fought yard by yard toward the Japanese defensive line. Private First Class Robert Sherrod, a combat correspondent attached to the assault force, crouched behind a disabled LVT and watched American industrial power adapt to battlefield conditions in real time. The initial plan had called for rapid penetration of the Japanese perimeter, but the enemy's defensive preparations had proved more formidable than anticipated. What impressed Sherrod was not the temporary setback, but the speed with which American commanders adjusted their tactics and brought new resources to bear. Within 2 hours of the initial landing, Navy underwater demolition teams were clearing obstacles in the lagoon using explosive charges manufactured by DuPont and designed specifically for coral reef operations. Combat engineers landed with specialized equipment for reducing concrete fortifications, shaped charges, demolition kits, and portable flamethrowers that had been developed through systematic industrial research and testing. The Japanese machine gun position that had been devastating the beach suddenly fell silent as a Sherman tank, landed by LST despite the challenging conditions, brought its 75mm gun to bear on the concrete bunker. The tank's arrival illustrated the fundamental advantage of American industrial logistics. While the Japanese had spent months building fixed fortifications, the Americans had developed the capability to land heavy armor directly onto hostile beaches and bring overwhelming firepower to bear. Against any defensive position, Sherrod watched as Marine riflemen advanced behind the tank, their movement coordinated through radio communications that connected every unit to Central Command. The radio equipment, mass-produced by companies like Motorola and RCA, represented another dimension of American industrial superiority. While Japanese units often fought in isolation once their telephone lines were severed, American forces maintained constant communication through equipment that was reliable, portable, and available in virtually unlimited quantities. The ammunition resupply operation provided the most striking demonstration of logistical superiority. Every Marine carried basic load ammunition for his weapons, but combat consumption quickly exhausted individual supplies. American planners had anticipated this requirement and organized a continuous flow of ammunition from ship to shore to fighting positions. Jeeps and tracked vehicles moved constantly between the beach and the front lines, delivering not just ammunition, but specialized equipment for specific tactical situations. A Japanese sniper in a concealed position had been engaging Marines with deadly accuracy until a Marine marksman eliminated the threat using a scoped rifle manufactured by Remington to specifications, developed by the National Rifle Association's technical staff. The weapon represented American industrial democracy in action, civilian expertise mobilized for military purposes through voluntary cooperation rather than state compulsion. By mid-afternoon, the fundamental equation of the battle had shifted decisively in favor of the Americans. Japanese defensive preparations, impressive as they were, represented a fixed investment that could not be reinforced or resupplied. American assault capabilities, by contrast, expanded continuously as more equipment and personnel landed on the island. Every hour that passed brought additional tanks, artillery pieces, flamethrowers, demolition equipment, and specialized weapons designed for specific tactical challenges. The POW. Japanese had built their strategy around the assumption that they could inflict casualties at a rate that would force the Americans to withdraw. This calculation might have been valid against a traditional military force operating with limited resources and political constraints. But the Americans had brought industrial warfare to Tarawa, a form of combat in which material resources mattered more than individual courage or tactical skill. Lieutenant Colonel Shoup, now commanding operations from a shell crater near the beach, radioed his assessment to higher headquarters. Casualties heavy, but advance continuing. Enemy resistance determined but showing signs of strain. Request continued ammunition resupply and medical evacuation. Estimate Japanese capability declining rapidly under pressure. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The message captured the essential dynamics of the battle. American casualties were indeed heavy, but they were casualties that could be replaced. Japanese resistance was indeed determined, but it was the determination of a finite force facing an enemy with apparently unlimited resources. In the sweltering heat of his concrete bunker, Private Kiyoshi Tanaka pressed his eye to the firing port and watched another wave of American landing craft approach the reef. The naval bombardment had lasted 3 hours, longer and more intense than anything in his military experience, but he and his comrades had survived by sheltering in the deepest bunkers and emerging only when the shelling stopped, and the Marines began their assault. Tanaka had been on Tarawa for 8 months, part of the garrison that had transformed the coral atoll into a fortress. He had helped pour concrete, install gun positions, and dig the tunnels that connected the defensive works. The labor had been backbreaking, carried out under the tropical sun with limited food and increasingly scarce supplies, but the results were impressive. The bunker that now sheltered him could withstand direct hits from battleship guns, its walls reinforced with steel rails and designed by Japanese engineers who understood the mathematics of stress and resistance. But as Tanaka watched the American assault unfold, he began to understand that his side had fundamentally miscalculated the nature of modern warfare. The Americans were not attacking with a single wave of assault troops that could be defeated through superior defensive preparations. Instead, they were demonstrating industrial capacity on a scale that rendered traditional military calculations meaningless. The landing craft kept coming, wave after wave of vehicles carrying Marines, equipment, and supplies. Tanaka had been trained to count enemy forces and estimate their capabilities, but the numbers he was observing defied comprehension. Hundreds of ships filled the lagoon and the sea beyond, more vessels than he had imagined existed in the entire American Navy. Aircraft circled overhead in formation so large that they darkened the sky. The Americans seemed to possess unlimited resources, fighting not with the forces immediately available, but with the full productive capacity of their industrial economy, the machine gun. Position adjacent to Tanaka's bunker had been silenced by a weapon he had never seen before, stream of liquid fire that had engulfed the concrete emplacement and forced the defenders to abandon their posts. The Americans had developed specialized equipment for every tactical challenge, from underwater obstacles to reinforced bunkers to concealed sniper positions. They fought not with standard infantry weapons, but with an arsenal of industrial innovations designed specifically for amphibious assault operations. Communication with other defensive positions had been severed within the first hour of the assault. Telephone lines buried deep in the coral had been cut by bombardment, and radio equipment had been damaged or destroyed. Tanaka's unit was fighting in isolation, unable to coordinate with adjacent positions or receive orders from higher command. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to maintain perfect communication, their movements coordinated, and their fire support precisely directed. The ammunition situation was becoming critical. Tanaka's unit had stockpiled supplies for an extended defensive battle, but combat consumption was exceeding all estimates. Japanese planners had calculated ammunition requirements based on peacetime training exercises and limited combat experience. They had not anticipated the intensity of industrial warfare, where American forces could bring overwhelming firepower to bear on individual positions until resistance was eliminated. Food and water were also running low. The garrison had been on reduced rations for weeks before the American assault, as submarine attacks had disrupted supply shipments from Japan. Now, with the battle raging and logistics personnel either dead or pinned down, it was becoming clear that the defenders could not sustain operations much longer without resupply that would never come. As evening approached, Tanaka could hear the sounds of American equipment being landed on the beaches his unit had been ordered to defend. Tanks, artillery pieces, and heavy weapons were being moved into position for the next phase of the assault. The Americans were not just fighting a battle. They were establishing a permanent foothold on Japanese territory, backed by industrial resources that could sustain operations indefinitely. The strategic situation was hopeless, But Tanaka and his surviving comrades would continue to fight. They had sworn to defend the empire to the death, and Japanese military tradition demanded that they honor that commitment regardless of tactical circumstances. Yet, as he prepared for another night of combat, Tanaka understood that they were facing something unprecedented in military history, an enemy whose power came not from martial tradition or individual courage, but from industrial capacity that could not be defeated through defensive preparations alone. Dawn of November 21st revealed the systematic demolition of Japanese resistance through overwhelming American firepower and logistics. Marine artillery, landed during the night by LSTs that had fought their way through coral obstacles, began a methodical reduction of enemy strong points using time-tested techniques refined through industrial research. Each gun position was supplied with more ammunition than the entire Japanese garrison possessed, and fire control was coordinated through radio networks that connected every battery to forward observers and aircraft spotters. Major General Julian Smith, commanding the 2nd Marine Division from his flagship, studied the tactical situation through reports that demonstrated the mathematical certainty of American victory. His forces had landed 5,000 Marines in the first 24 hours, along with 30 tanks, 40 artillery pieces, and enough supplies to sustain combat operations for a week. The Japanese garrison, estimated at 4,500 men, was cut off from reinforcement and resupply, fighting with diminishing ammunition stocks and no prospect of relief. The breakthrough came when Marine combat engineers, using demolition techniques developed by civilian mining companies, destroyed the central bunker complex that anchored the Japanese defensive line. The explosives had been manufactured by DuPont using industrial processes that could produce more demolition charges in a single day than Japan used in a month of combat operations. When the charges detonated, they created a gap in the defensive perimeter that allowed Sherman tanks to advance into the island's interior. Tank infantry coordination represented another dimension of American tactical superiority. The Sherman crews had trained extensively with Marine rifle companies, practicing the combined operations that were essential for reducing fortified positions. Their radios allowed instant communication with supporting infantry, artillery forward observers, and aircraft controllers. This integration of different combat arms was possible only through the standardized equipment and training procedures that American industrial organization made possible. Air support arrived with clockwork precision as Navy and Marine Corps aviators demonstrated the tactical flexibility that came from overwhelming numerical superiority. F-4U Corsairs, equipped with rockets and bombs, struck Japanese positions with surgical accuracy, using target coordinates provided by ground controllers and navigation aids manufactured by American electronics companies. The aircraft represented not just individual weapon systems, but components of an integrated battle network that could concentrate firepower wherever it was needed. The cascade effect accelerated as Japanese resistance crumbled under sustained pressure. From forces that seemed to possess unlimited resources, every position destroyed was immediately replaced by American equipment landed from the fleet. Every tactical success was exploited through rapid reinforcement and resupply operations that Japanese planners had not anticipated. The Americans fought not a battle of attrition, but a campaign of systematic occupation backed by industrial capacity that rendered enemy resistance mathematically irrelevant. Japanese attempts at counterattack collapsed against defensive positions that were continuously reinforced and resupplied. Marine units that had been reduced to half strength by casualties were brought back to full combat effectiveness through replacement personnel landed from transport ships that maintained station offshore. Ammunition expenditures that would have exhausted traditional military units were sustained through logistics networks that connected the battlefield to production facilities thousands of miles away. Lieutenant Colonel Shoup, now commanding from a captured Japanese bunker, reported to division headquarters, enemy resistance collapsing systematically. American industrial superiority decisive factor. Japanese defensive preparations impressive but insufficient against unlimited logistic support. estimate complete island control within 24 hours. The assessment proved conservative. Japanese defensive doctrine, based on inflicting maximum casualties on attacking forces, had failed to account for an enemy that could absorb losses and continue advancing through replacement of personnel and equipment. American victory was not just tactical but systematic, the triumph of industrial organization over military tradition. The final phase of the Edo Battle of Tarawa unfolded with the mechanical precision of an industrial process. By the morning of November 22nd, Japanese resistance had been reduced to isolated pockets of defenders who continued fighting despite the mathematical certainty of defeat. These were not coordinated defensive positions, but individual bunkers cut off from communication and supply. Defended by soldiers who had accepted death but refused surrender, Marine casualties mounted steadily as the fighting entered its most dangerous phase. Reducing each bunker required close-quarters combat using flamethrowers, demolition charges, and direct assault techniques that exposed attackers to deadly fire from concealed positions. The human cost was severe, over 1,000 Marines killed and 2,000 wounded in 76 hours of continuous combat, but these were losses that American industrial capacity could replace through training programs that graduated new Marines faster than combat could eliminate them. Hospital. Ships offshore received the wounded with medical efficiency that reflected American industrial organization. Applied to battlefield health care. Blood plasma manufactured by pharmaceutical companies. Portable surgical equipment designed by civilian hospitals, and evacuation procedures developed through systematic study of combat casualties created a medical support system that saved lives which would have been lost in previous wars. Even in caring for the wounded, American industrial superiority provided decisive advantages. The Japanese garrison fought with desperate courage, but courage without industrial support could not overcome the systematic application of overwhelming force. Admiral Shibasaki was killed when Marine artillery destroyed his command bunker, the concrete walls that had seemed impregnable proving inadequate against American explosives, delivered in quantities that Japanese planners had not imagined possible. His death symbolized the collapse of defensive strategies based on static fortification against an enemy. With mobile industrial power, individual acts of heroism on both sides could not alter the fundamental dynamics of industrial warfare. Japanese soldiers died at their posts in accordance with military tradition, but their sacrifice could not overcome American ability to land replacement equipment faster than it could be destroyed. Marine heroes like Lieutenant William Hawkins, who died leading assault operations against enemy strong points, were mourned and honored, but their tactical objectives were achieved through systematic application of superior resources rather than individual courage alone. The final tally revealed the mathematics of industrial victory. In 76 hours, American forces had landed 18,000 Marines, 50 tanks, 100 artillery pieces, and 10,000 tons of supplies on a hostile beach defended by prepared positions and determined enemies. The Japanese garrison of 4,500 men had been virtually eliminated, with fewer than 20 prisoners taken, and the remainder killed in action. The disparity in casualties, over 4,000 Japanese dead compared to 1,000 American dead, reflected not just tactical superiority, but the industrial capacity that made such overwhelming force. Possible material losses told an even more striking story. The Japanese had lost their entire defensive investment. Months of construction work, stockpiled ammunition and supplies, heavy weapons that could not be replaced, and trained personnel whose military skills had taken years to develop. American losses, while significant in human terms, represented materials that could be replaced within weeks through production systems that operated continuously, regardless of individual battles. The strategic implications extended far beyond Tarawa itself. Japanese military planners, studying the battle's outcome, realized that their defensive strategy was fundamentally flawed against an enemy with unlimited industrial resources. No fortification could be built strong enough to withstand bombardment by forces that possessed more ammunition than the defenders could ever hope to stockpile. No garrison could be made large enough to resist assault by enemies who could land reinforcements faster than casualties could be inflicted. As the guns fell silent on Betio Island, Marine burial details began the grim task of honoring their fallen comrades while preparing for the next amphibious assault. The industrial machinery of war continued operating without pause, ships loading supplies for future operations, factories producing replacement equipment, training camps graduating new Marines to fill the ranks depleted by combat. The silence that descended over Tarawa on November 23, 1943, marked more than the end of a single battle. It announced the beginning of Japan's inevitable defeat in the Pacific War, as Marine burial parties worked under the tropical sun, interring both American heroes and Japanese dead with the respect due to warriors. The strategic implications of the 76-hour campaign became clear to military planners on both sides of the Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific Fleet operations from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, studied the battle reports with satisfaction, tempered by somber recognition of the human cost. The statistics told a story of American industrial supremacy that even he had not fully appreciated. In 3 days of combat, American forces had expended more ammunition than the Japanese had stockpiled for 6 months of defensive operations. The logistics network that supported the Marines had delivered supplies to the battlefield faster than combat could consume them, maintaining fighting effectiveness despite continuous casualties. The industrial dimensions of victory were staggering. American shipyards had produced the landing craft used at Tarawa in quantities that exceeded Japanese naval construction for the entire war. Aircraft factories had delivered more planes to support the operation than Japan possessed in its entire Pacific theater. The production statistics read like fantasy. 1 Liberty ship launched every 42 days, 1 aircraft carrier commissioned every month, 1 bomber completed every hour around the clock. But the human achievement transcended mere production numbers. The Marines who had stormed the beaches of Betio represented American democratic society, mobilized for war. Citizen soldiers drawn from farms and factories, trained through systematic programs that developed military effectiveness without destroying individual initiative. Their victory demonstrated that democratic societies, when threatened, could generate military power that totalitarian states could not match through coercion and ideology alone. Colonel David Shoup, now commanding the secure island, walked among the captured Japanese fortifications with professional admiration for enemy engineering skill. The concrete bunkers were masterpieces of defensive construction designed by competent engineers and built by dedicated workers. Under different circumstances, against an enemy with limited resources, these positions might have proven impregnable. But they had been overwhelmed not through tactical brilliance or individual heroism, but through the systematic application of industrial power that could not be resisted through defensive preparations alone. The captured Japanese equipment told its own story of industrial inequality. Enemy weapons were well designed and effectively employed, but they existed in quantities that could not compete with American production. A single American ammunition ship carried more artillery shells than the entire Japanese garrison possessed. 1 aircraft carrier embarked more planes than Japan could deploy to defend the entire Gilbert Islands chain. The disparity was not in quality but in quantity, the fundamental advantage of democratic industrial organization over authoritarian military tradition. Medical statistics provided another measure of American superiority. Marine casualties, while severe, were treated through medical systems that saved lives at rates unprecedented in military history. Hospital ships equipped with surgical facilities, blood plasma manufactured by civilian pharmaceutical companies, and evacuation procedures developed through systematic study created a healthcare network that turned potentially fatal wounds into recoverable injuries. Even in caring for the wounded, American industrial capacity provided decisive advantages. The Battle of Tarawa, fought in November 1943, demonstrated the immense strategic and industrial power of the United States in the Pacific theater. Japanese military planners analyzing the operation realized that no static fortification could withstand an assault by a force with unlimited logistic support. The U.S. had a distinct advantage: industrial capacity. This battle highlighted that American democracy, when mobilized for war, could generate military power unmatched by totalitarian regimes. The battle itself saw American losses of 1,009 killed and 2,101 wounded, while Japanese casualties exceeded 4,700, with fewer than 150 prisoners taken. This casualty ratio of nearly 5:1 underscored the effectiveness of overwhelming firepower. More importantly, the U.S. could replace its losses rapidly, while Japan's trained personnel were irreplaceable. The material disparities were even more striking. American forces fired 15,000 rounds of naval gunfire, more ammunition than the entire Japanese garrison possessed. Aircraft dropped 1,600 tons of bombs, and the U.S. logistics network delivered 10,000 tons of supplies, maintaining combat capability that Japan could not match. American factories produced 200 aircraft, 50 tanks, and 500 trucks during the battle, demonstrating the continuous flow of military resources, far outpacing the Japanese ability to replenish their forces. Technological innovations were key to U.S. success. Amphibious tractors, developed by civilian engineers and military planners, allowed for effective landings on coral reefs. Communication systems maintained coordination under fire, while other specialized equipment, like weapons for fortress reduction, reflected the systematic application of American industrial and technological capacity to military problems. The U.S. Marines at Tarawa were trained to think critically and adapt under pressure, a key advantage over Japan's more rigid military structure. This flexibility was a result of democratic training methods that emphasized problem-solving over obedience. The strategic implications of Tarawa resonated beyond the Pacific. German and Japanese military leaders realized that the industrial power that overwhelmed Japanese defenses could be used against European fortifications. The battle demonstrated that no defensive position could resist the systematic application of American industrial firepower. Japanese defense strategies had to shift from static to mobile defense, which played to American strengths. Tarawa also revealed that American democracy could mobilize for war in ways that totalitarian regimes could not. The willingness of the American public to accept casualties, as exemplified by the Marines who died at Tarawa, surprised Japanese leaders who had believed that the U.S. would not tolerate the losses necessary for the Pacific campaign. This battle thus proved the resilience of American democracy, showing that democratic societies, when properly organized and equipped, could defeat any totalitarian threat. The Battle of Tarawa had broader implications for military doctrine. The principles demonstrated at Tarawa, overwhelming firepower, coordinated air and naval support, and sustainable logistics, became the foundation for subsequent U.S. operations across the Pacific, from Kwajalein to Okinawa. The use of amphibious vehicles, specialized equipment, and integrated communication systems became standard in American amphibious warfare. American industrial mobilization, exemplified by the Tarawa campaign, proved that the U.S. could produce more military equipment than its enemies. The numbers were staggering: 1 escort carrier every week, 1 destroyer every 4 days, and 9,000 aircraft per month, more than the combined production of all enemy nations. This industrial output was not a one-time surge, but a continuous increase in capacity, driven by expanding factories and improved manufacturing techniques. The strategic lessons of Tarawa extended beyond the Pacific. Intelligence analyses showed that the Japanese were shocked by the scale and efficiency of American operations, which proved that modern warfare was increasingly about material superiority and logistical coordination, not just individual bravery or static fortifications. The technological advancements from the battle, such as improved amphibious warfare equipment and communication systems, laid the groundwork for future conflicts. From the Cold War to modern-day military engagements, the Marines who fought at Tarawa embodied the spirit of sacrifice and dedication to freedom. Their willingness to fight and die in the name of democracy validated the principle that democratic societies could generate military power superior to totalitarian regimes. This legacy of sacrifice and innovation became the foundation for U.S. military doctrine, emphasizing the importance of overwhelming force, logistical support, and technological superiority. In the years following Tarawa, the strategic paradigm shifted. The battle's lessons were applied to other major campaigns in the Pacific, demonstrating that American military power was a result of not just individual heroism, but the systematic application of democratic principles, industrial resources, and technological innovation. Tarawa marked a turning point not just in the Pacific War, but in the history of modern warfare. Today, the Battle of Tarawa endures as a symbol of American industrial democracy's military supremacy. It remains a key example of how a nation can mobilize its resources for war and produce overwhelming results. The Marines' heroism at Tarawa validated the power of a free society to defend itself against authoritarian threats, proving that democracy, when mobilized, could achieve victory where totalitarian regimes would inevitably falter. If you enjoyed the story I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy, please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.